$10 reward. Absconded from the household of the President of the United States on Saturday afternoon, Ona Judge, a light mulatto girl, much freckled, with very black eyes and bushy black hair. She is of middle stature, but slender and delicately made, about 20 years of age. As there was no suspicion of her going off, and it happened without the least provocation, it is not easy to conjecture whither she is gone or fully. You know, for 10 years between 1790 and 1800, the United States capital was in Philadelphia. When the hero of the Revolution, the founding father, the first president of the United States of America, George Washington, learned that a slave could sue for freedom if he or she lived in the city of Philadelphia for more than 6 months, he and Martha began shuttling between their plantation in Virginia and the presidential mansion in Philadelphia. And in a pinch, they would take their slaves to New Jersey to keep them from reaching that 6-month threshold. There was a thriving community of free blacks in Philadelphia. Ona ran to freedom because the Washingtons were going to leave Philadelphia for good and take up residence in Mount Vernon. And Martha was going to make a gift of Ona to her granddaughter, Elizabeth, who was about to be married to Thomas Law by way of Great Britain, by way of India, bringing with him his 2 sons of color by a woman of India. Ona could only imagine, didn't have to imagine, what might be in store for her. It was time to run to freedom. What must it have been like to live as a fugitive, formerly enslaved person, to be free and to be hunted by the most powerful person on the continent? And George and Martha were determined to get her back. They found her. They learned and then knew she was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and they sent their people to negotiate her return. She wouldn't go. President Washington said, "To enter into a compromise with her is totally inadmissible." He was offended by the thought of negotiating with one of his slaves. He couldn't conceive of rewarding bad behavior with freedom. He wrote, "The ingratitude of the girl, who was brought up more like a child than a servant. She ought not to escape with impunity." When they went to forcibly bring her back, she was gone. And here's a wonderful historical irony. On the very same page of the New Hampshire Gazette that reported George Washington's words of farewell and appreciation to the nation, on the very same page of the newspaper, there was a notice of Ona's marriage to a free black man, John Staines. 10 words: "In this town, Mr. John Staines to Miss Oni Judge. And the irony is even deeper and more delicious. Ona Judge Staines and Elizabeth Custis Law, the Washington granddaughter to whom Ona was to be given as property, both gave birth to girls they named Eliza. Every year there are reenactments of Washington crossing the Delaware River, standing, looking resolute and like the general he was at, well, Washington's Crossing, just a few miles from my home in Trenton. I want this reenacted. I want this reenacted. This chase scene without cars and blow-ups and flips and crashes, just words, ideas, unlikely characters clashing and sparring against the backstory of a nation born from a bloody revolution for freedom and thriving on the bondage and exploitation of Africans. Who is it after God's own heart after all? George Washington or Ona Judge? We've been celebrating him for 240 years and we've just barely discovered her. He fought a bloody revolution over taxation and representation and yet was incensed that she no longer wanted to dress his wife, be his slave. We are always in the midst of a season of Lent. And it's a good thing, too, because 40 days isn't enough time to pray and fast, give and serve, to get ready for what comes next. Betrayal, abandonment, silence and conflict, ear-slicing anger, jeering crowds and hypocrisy in the highest levels of government in society and in the church, violence and death, confusion and grief. Is it all in vain? Is there reason to hope? We are always in a season of Lent when we know what is coming because we know our past and we know the present, and all are filled with individual pain and suffering, grief, difficult to impossible changes, catastrophic events, looming environmental metamorphosis. And we are always in a season of boundless joy because we and the world are redeemed by a God of creation and a spirit of communion and a Savior in our very human form, unlikely, maybe even last chosen, under most unusual circumstances, wishing the cup might pass, but drinking anyway, the cup of courage to endure, the cup of forgiveness and reconciliation, the cup of justice and love. Samuel grieved Saul. It's actually somewhat hard to fathom after he had just humiliated Saul and brought an end to his reign as the first king of Israel. But there is room for lament, for grief at so momentous a fall. This necessitates the need for a new king, and so Saul travels to, good Lord, Bethlehem, Jesse's house, where he passes on big, strapping Mount Rushmore young men who fit the type thought born to lead, and settles on a little pretty boy with beautiful eyes. We're told not to be fooled by outward appearance and counseled that the Lord looks on the heart. But the first thing we get is a description of David's pleasing appearance. And David is the one after God's own heart. And David is the one after God's own heart. David the adulterer, the king who had a loyal soldier killed to steal his wife. David, the king who on his deathbed commanded Solomon to seek revenge on one of his old and by then helpless enemies. These are complicated matters. This seeing with God's eyes, the choices we make for leadership, this reconciling the arc of history, bending toward justice with walls and budget cuts and more armaments and for-profit elementary schools and bathroom policing and health care for some. I just want to take a minute, a little bit of an aside here. Long live Obamacare! May it survive until we turn it into universal, get sick and we got you. Health care for all. We continue on our Lenten journey, preparing like Ona did for the jump to freedom. Where am I going? How am I going to get there? Where can I find help? Who can I trust? How can I leave my family behind? Can I survive the grief at so deep a loss as those none of us escapes? Ona outlived both of her daughters and perhaps her son as well. We just don't know. For a long time, she lived in a household of 5 women in the deep poverty of antebellum America. In the last years of her life, she was interviewed and asked if she regretted escape from President Washington since her life had been so hard. She said, "No, I am free, and I trust, been made a child of God by the means." Grief is in the ground of our humanity. You get to a certain age and the phone rings, and fear is in the space between the ringtones. What news is this? We get through these 40 days, perhaps, by the Sabbath days that grace the season. The many Easters that tell of the good news to come. We grieve our losses. We grieve the lies we tell about our history that doom us to repeat our mistakes, to make flawed choices about what it takes to extract ourselves from the quicksand of personal and national history. We grieve and we grow. It is always Lent, It is ever Easter, a season of boundless joy, because we are in a world that is redeemed by a God of creation and a spirit of communion and a Savior in our very human form, unlikely, maybe even last chosen under most unusual circumstances, wishing the cup might pass but drinking anyway, the cup of courage to endure and to change, the cup of forgiveness and reconciliation, the cup of justice and love, good to the last drop. Amen.